Cadet Verity eliminated! Elsie's frustration at the sound of Maureen being eliminated was somewhat offset by the death of her killer. She had no idea how that had happened, and she couldn't ask either, as both Tala and Maureen were still connected to each other. The situation wasn't helped by the rest of the first year slipping the noose. Though not without losses of their own, she thought, as she glanced down at the down form of Team 7's Dark Elf if she didn't miss her mark. The Dark Elf was a bit stockier. "You okay?" she asked, head on a swivel, as she cautiously moved up to Sherry's crouched form. "Fine," the girl grunted irritably, as she visibly resisted the urge to rub her eyes through her helmet. 2 simultaneous flashbang spells to the face couldn't have been fun. Hell, she'd probably have been killed if she hadn't thought to immediately respond in kind. And been equipped with a pretty ideal weapon for that kind of close-range fight. The volley bow might not have had the longevity of a regular bolt bow where ammo capacity to concern, but the ability to unleash a veritable barrage of shots at a moment's notice was not to be underestimated. Well, that, combined with the fact that Sherry being the only member of their team who wasn't the scion of some noble house, she was just that talented. As evidenced by the dead first year sprawled out, and probably glaring at them, nearby. Casually, Elsie stepped over to the rifle through the Dark Elf's pockets in search of fresh clips. For just a moment, she considered the girl's downed wax bolt before dismissing the thought. Curious as she might have been about the weapon, mid-match wasn't the time to start playing with new equipment. For one thing, she had no idea how the thing even fired, given that she couldn't see any kind of ether tank on the long-barreled weapon. Standing up, she hustled back over to Sherry. "Well, it's just 2 left now. The High Elf and Ashfield himself," Elsie thought, as she and Sherry crouched practically back to back behind a pile of lumber. Tapping her helmet again, she was relieved as the orb channel came to life this time. "Tala, you okay?" "Fine!" the girl in question grunted, with what sounded like audible discomfort. It seemed whatever had happened had left her feeling a little worse for wear, though good luck getting their leader to admit that. She also knew better than to ask what happened to Maureen, mostly how the girl had managed to die to a first-year orc in a 2-on-1 matchup. There was a time and a place for that kind of discussion, though, and this wasn't it. "We've down there dark, but the last 2 are in the wind." "What? How?" the girl practically wheezed. "Actually, never mind. What direction do they head in?" "East flank. The tower should be between you and them." "All right," Tala grunted, clearly creating a mental map. "You've got permission to pursue, but don't get cocky. Standing orders regarding the new weapon remain. Stay low and close to cover. I'll loop back towards our starting location and we'll pincer them." "Understood," Elsie said, closing the comms and turning to Sherry. "We're going after them. Stay low." The other girl scoffed behind her helmet as she stood up. "Obviously." In moments, the 2 were moving, darting around rubble with quick bursts of ether as they kept their eyes peeled. Still, it was somewhat inevitable that, unless their foe was still in flight, they see the third years before the opposite was true. The first warning was a burst of bolts that clattered across Elsie's armor, though none managed to find purchase in her soft undersuit. "Contact!" she shouted, catching sight of a distant figure even as she darted into cover. "Bearing 11. "Confirmed," Sherry called back, as she too slid to a stop behind cover. It seemed the first years were sticking to their strategy of hugging the outer walls of the arena, though given that they were clearly out of wax rounds, that was likely a decision born of strategic inertia rather than proper reasoning. With that said, there wasn't really a right option at this point. Outclassed and outnumbered, with their special munitions clearly depleted, this match was all but over. With that said, Elsie wasn't so foolish as to let her guard down, as she popped up to exchange fire with a distant cadet. Across from her, Sherry used the opportunity to advance before laying down her own barrage of shots. They didn't need to communicate for this bit. It was as rote as could be, as they alternately moved to flank the first year's last holdout. 2 separate plumes of ether rang out from the pile the first years were hiding behind, as they fired with frankly horrific accuracy towards both her and Sherry. Definitely freaked and running on instinct, Elsie thought absently. Though what did they expect after challenging a team with 2 years of experience over them? Clearly they'd been banking on their new wonder weapon to carry them through. Like idiots. Final to a corner, Tala, Elsie reported, as she slid to a stop just short of the first year's final refuge. Possible they're having ammo trouble. Second to stop firing. Make no assumptions. Hold position. I'm coming up behind you now. Sure enough, Elsie heard the telltale burst of ether, accompanied by the low thud of something hitting dirt, as Tala slid to a stop behind her. Sherry, you move on 3. We'll move on 4, the girl reported. Hand to her ear, suggesting she switched orbs to speak to Sherry. Sequential flashes as soon as you break cover. Sherry, Elsie, me, Sherry. Care for crossfire once we turn the corner. Elsie nodded. The last thing they needed to do was blind or shoot each other. 1. Sherry fired off a few rounds. 2. Then Elsie. 3. There was a burst of ether as the team's most heavily armored surviving member rocketed out of cover, the tail end of a spell on her lips. Which Elsie didn't hear, nor did she see, as she glanced away just as a retina-bursting flash erupted from her teammate's position, along with an earth-shaking boom. Instead, she focused on chanting under her breath. 4, Tala grunted, just as she and Elsie erupted from their own cover. The two jetted across the intervening space as they swept wide to the first year's position. Elsie's voice roaring, "Invoke the power of our covenant! Light and noise! Flashbang!" Light blasted forth along with an ungodly noise as they sought to deafen and blind the first years. And that was when something slammed into her back, splattering upwards to strike the back of her helmet. "What?" she grunted, as the unexpected blow forced her flight trajectory down towards the dirt, and given that she'd been skimming but a few inches from it before, that was all it took to send her skidding across it in an ungainly heap. It was not graceful, and the only thing that saved it from being worse was the fast reactions of Tala that kept her from flying directly into her. Instead, the girl overshot with a sudden flare of ether. "Cadet Sherry eliminated! Cadet Elsie eliminated!" And sure enough, as Elsie glanced up, she saw that Sherry was likewise sprawled out. An orange stain blasted across her back. But how? She thought as she twisted, only to see a single figure silhouetted against the ceiling lights as they stood atop the watchtower, long-barreled rifle aimed and ready. But there was only 2. And glancing over, she saw it, as the boy, Ashfield, rose from behind the pile with a bolt bow in each arm. He tricked them. There'd never been a second shooter behind the pile. Instead, she made her way toward the tower, which was why he positioned himself against the wall. It put their backs to the tower. That was such bullshit. Tala should have seen the girl on the way past, unless she timed her climb to start the moment their team leader went past. It was a short window to claim a firing position, but doable with a quick burst of ether and a full tank. Even if it was absurdly lucky. Hell, the reason they hadn't heard Sherry go down, even with the delay between how fast a waxbow could fire, was because the noise had been drowned out by the fucking flashbangs. All those thoughts went through her mind in a moment as she turned towards her leader. A leader who'd seen her go down, and was now torn between trying to evade the target to her rear and eliminating the one right in front of her. And that momentary hesitation cost her, as both the Ashfield and the High Elf fired at once, rounds slamming into Tala from both sides, though not before she got off a shot of her own. Silence rang out across the arena, as their team leader dropped like a stone. Cadet Tala eliminated. Cadet William eliminated. The voice sounded almost as stunned as Elsie felt. Silence reigned across the arena. Team 7-1, win. Olzenia felt her body go limp as she practically collapsed. nerveless fingers barely managing to hold onto the spell bolt she just used to wipe out 3 members of the enemy team. She couldn't believe it. Actually, could not believe it. She thought they were done when Marlene went down. Hell, she thought they were done when she and Bolin had missed their targets in the opening moments of the match. Losing Marlene to a fluke shot had just sealed it in her mind. She'd wanted to be the bait when William told her his new plan. Truly. Anything to avoid the pressure of being the shooter. After all, William was the much better shot. Only he couldn't do that, because he'd instead chosen to try and perform a miracle before the match even started. "Told you that you could do it." An irritatingly smug voice slurred into her ear. "Like shooting fish in a barrel." Though how much of that was down to the harpy venom running through William's veins, and how much was down to the peculiar invention he created, she didn't know. She knew for a fact his words were horseshit. "There's my tutoring coming in strong," Marlene grunted. Only slightly surly about her fluke downing, but mostly just proud. "Well done, Oz," Verity whispered. I'm sorry I left you guys in the lurch." Yeah, she did great. William had an insane plan that somehow worked. Marlene's tutoring is very helpful. Verity should learn to double tap. That's great," Bolin slurred. "How long do you think it'll be until the rest get out here with anti-venom? Because I've got a spur poking right into my left ass cheek. Like, right in there." "Right ass cheek?" William scoffed. "I take that any day. I'm practically doing the splits here." "That doesn't sound so bad," Verity said. "It is if you've got a pair of testicles," Marlene muttered. It was all Ozenia could do not to laugh as her team slurred, whined and cheered into her ears, as if they hadn't just performed the impossible. Or as if they weren't speaking to each other from across an impossible distance, as with little to mar their voice beyond a middling crackle. Were they all going mad? Had they joined William in his insanity? One of the most important magical innovations in recent memory, and they were using it to complain about how they'd fallen uncomfortably in a fight against a team of third years that they'd also impossibly beaten. How it worked, she didn't know. William had just said electromagnetism and vibrations, as he practically jammed the small metal bead into her ear. Into all their ears. An almost hysterical chuckle tried to slip from her throat. Instantaneous communication between 5 people, with little more than a few spell charges and some metal. Sure, William claimed it'd be lucky if the enchantment lasted an hour, but that was just typical of him. Do the impossible and then act like it was nothing. And as much as she hated to admit it, he needed to perform the impossible. Disrupting Tala's ambush, so Verity could get the drop on her other attacker? Only possible because she'd been able to communicate that need for aid to William. Their simultaneous 3-pronged assault on the armored girl? Even if Marlene had gotten unlucky, that breakout had only been possible because they'd been able to move as one. And finally, her climbing of the tower to get an open shot on their backs? Only possible because William had told her the moment Tala was focused on him. She'd certainly not been able to make that judgment from where she'd been hiding. Ether bursts weren't that loud. Finally, timing her shots so they'd not be heard? Only possible because he'd been relaying the timing of their chanting. Without that, well, she might have gotten one, but the other 2 would have scattered and then it would be a 2-on-2 against superior opponents, with William practically out of ammo, and Ozenia herself completely bereft of a bolt bow, and down to a single wax round. No, they'd not have won that. Perhaps if he'd had Marlene or Verity at his back, it might have been possible. Not her, though. Or perhaps not. Some part of her wanted to gloat, to preen, to claim her accomplishment as her own, and hers alone. But that was a small part, one that more and more she found she wanted to leave behind. For just a moment, she wondered if her sister was watching, if she was afraid. She hoped so, but it was a distant thing. Because right now all she wanted to focus on was this feeling. this sense of triumph, of camaraderie, like she could take on the world, like she belonged. And that feeling only grew as the crowds around them finally started to cheer, some because Team 7 had been the underdog, some because they were abolitionists, some just because they wanted to see House Blackstone be humbled. Xenia didn't care why they were cheering. It didn't matter. Not really. Only the people cheering, bickering, or just plain being smug in her rear counted. And she wouldn't have it any other way. Speaking of awkward positions, she muttered, as she watched members of staff making their way into the field. Could, one of you direct someone to come and retrieve me? For some reason, her legs just refused to cooperate. It wasn't the result of harpy venom or anything like that. They just seemed to be done for the day. A sentiment she could well get behind. The next time William needed 3/5 of a third-year team wiping out, he could damn well do it himself. She was done. For the rest of the year, at least. Our conquering hero, everyone, Bonlin laughed. About to be carried down from her lofty perch in a bucket. Huh. Xenia didn't care. She'd wiped out 3/5 of a third-year team in her first semester. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. Not a damn thing. Perhaps being insane isn't too bad, she murmured, as she plucked the metal bead from her ear.